Hello. Thank you for joining Liberating the Queen, a podcast where we discuss amazing women in history that weren't in my history books. My goal for 2018 is to share what I have learned with all of you the 15th of every month for the year of 2018. My name is Susie Moscow, and today is May 15th, 2018. This episode is brought to you by Flip 'em the Bird. When you don't have the words, our gloves will say it for you. We actually have a special guest host who returned for her second visit to Liberating the Queen, the owner and operator of Peppermint Bay and my daughter, Layla Moscow. She did such a great job last week. We insisted on having her back this week.
Hello, everyone. I am happy to be here today.
Today, we are taking a deeper look at a heroic female warrior, Buffalo Calf Road. This story is an important one to tell. When I was growing up, I was told many stories that involved more the heroics of men. Women in these stories were often portrayed as not having the skill set to react in times of danger or abilities to really defend themselves. Buffalo Calf Road not only defended her family, but her land and her tribe. So join Layla and I as we travel back into the 1800s. I wanted to talk about the sources of this podcast. We ran into some issues similar to what we had with Jean Beret. We couldn't locate a lot of source material that was from her perspective. However, unlike Jean Beret, who was on a scientific mission, she had a lot of accounts and many records of others that were logging daily routines. So the details you could kind of piece together based on multiple accounts. However, in this, there is no diaries or records, only oral accounts of those present at the events. So Buffalo Calf Road is only known through oral history accounts of really Cheyenne contemporaries. There were two women in particular, Kate Bighead and Iron Teeth, who tell of her exploits in many interviews. We also have the work of Mary Sandoz, who writes a lot around the flight north from Indian Territory, and her research is based on interviews of women who were present, and that would really include the old Cheyenne women. Most of the men who fought with Buffalo Calf Road fails to mention her exploits, with really one exception, and that of a gentleman named Wooden Leg. He was a warrior who fought beside her. He told tales of heroic acts and provided really detailed accounts of her in battle. And really during the period when she gave birth, before the small band of 30 surrendered, there are deep depictions of her within her life that he could really account for. There are no photos of her, just two ledger, really book sketches. One of her saving her brother in battle, and another drawn by Amos Badheart Bull of her riding into battle with her brother. So at this time, the research that we have is really limited, but it was really exciting to be able to find what we could and really elevate this story to a level where we felt we could podcast for it. Now, Layla, I know that you love like Ninja Warrior shows and being involved in real physical activity. Do you think you would ever be a part of an army or some kind of special forces or some kind of ninja?
Well, I don't really know because if I would, I don't really want to because I don't want to die.
That's fair. It's fair to be scared of that.
What?
It's fair to be scared of that.
Yeah, that's my choice.
That is your choice. It's well known that women warriors were not uncommon in various nations, especially as we learn more about the Viking DNA that was really discovered of a leader that was always assumed to be a man to be a woman. But in Cheyenne oral history certainly speaks to Buffalo Calf Road as a courageous woman in battle and not super common to have women in battle. She has a really remarkable story. She's a young Cheyenne warrior woman. Really, there's a span of 3 years in her life from 1876 until 1879 when she dies, where it's a really pivotal moment for not only her, but for everybody that's around her. During those 3 years is really the time when the Cheyenne were caught into the westward expansion of pioneers, miners, and the army, all determined to colonize the land. And she really was part of the group of people that stood up against it and wanted to make sure that there was a future for her family and a future for everyone around her. In 1876, the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho people defended their sovereignty, their land, and their lives against the United States. The Rosebud and Little Bighorn battles proved the tribe's military strength, but ultimately contributed to tragic consequences for the victors. A young Cheyenne mother, Buffalo Calf Road woman, fought alongside her brother and husband at both battles in defense of Cheyenne freedom. Buffalo Calf Road woman lived during the Indian Wars, an era of extreme violence against the native inhabitants to the west. American settlers frequently trespassed onto tribal lands, and tribes retaliated by raiding settler camps. Now, Layla, recently we visited the Minnesota Historical Museum, and they had a lot about Native American history and all of the different things that we learned about. There was one game in particular that you and your brother Liam played, and it was a game of options where you had to make decisions based on what the Native Americans had for options. And I remember you and Liam being very frustrated with the game. Did you think the game was fair, or what did you think about the game?
I don't think it was fair at all because we lost all our money and we lost all our land, like half of our land.
Right. And your option was if
and
you didn't take it.
Starving.
Your option was if people weren't going to take it, you would possibly die, right?
Pretty much. But at one point, they were like starving.
Right. You think that was fair for the United States government to do that?
No.
Right.
Because I was Indians. Well, now I get it. So totally understands now. You may keep talking.
Thank you. If anybody has any interest, I believe the exhibit should still be running, but it is amazing, and I would encourage people to go see it if you're in Minnesota. And to kind of build on what Layla was saying, there was several brutal massacres of peaceful tribal groups by whites led to widespread fear among the tribes and shocked the American public. Such violence increased tensions in the region. After Lakota Chief Red Cloud decisively defeated the U.S. military in 1864 to close the Bozeman Trail, the United States negotiated a peace treaty with the Lakotas. The 1868 Fort Laramine, I think that's how you say it, I apologize, treaty established the Great Sioux Nation, a huge reservation encompassing present-day western South Dakota, and designated the unceded lands between the Black Hills and the Bighorn Mountains, including the Powder River country. For the Indians, quote-unquote, absolutely an undisturbed use, end quote. Northern Cheyenne and Arapaho bands also occupied this region. In 1874, the United States government sent General George Custer, who had led a massacre against the Southern Cheyennes 4 years earlier, to explore the Black Hills. When the expedition found gold, the government sought to buy the Black Hills, but the Lakotas refused. Fearing conflict, the government ordered all Indians who remained on the land to go to the Sioux Reservation by January of 1876, declaring the troops would deal forcibly with anyone who refused. However, the region was critical to their existence, since it remained prime hunting ground for what was left for once vast buffalo herds. No matter how brave Buffalo Calf Road woman was, she was fighting a losing battle against the federal government. The whole tribe was constantly pursued by U.S. troops. Her warrior husband, Black Coyote, and the other Cheyenne in their group had been one that really fought against it and went on the run almost to the point of starvation. The tribes were caught in a double bind: retreat to the reservation and possibly starve, or continue to occupy their full territory and risk attack. In the summer of 1876, several hundred Cheyenne and Lakotas camped in the Powder River and Little Bighorn valleys. Buffalo Calf Road woman, her husband Black Coyote, their daughter, And her brother comes in sights were among the Cheyennes in these lands. This is when the first battle is when we see really the first tension rise. Earlier that year, Crook's men had burned a Cheyenne village. Not wanting to face the same fate, Cheyenne and Lakota warriors attacked Crook's troops at Rosebud on June 17th. When soldiers shot Comes in sight, horses and he fell. Buffalo Calf Road woman rode into the heart of the battle amid the shower of arrows and bullets. She helped her brother cling to her horse and carried him to safety. At the end of the day, Crook's command withdrew, unable to defeat the tribes. The Lakotas and the Cheyennes fled, some joining those camped on the Little Bighorn. 8 days later, Custer's regiment attacked the Cheyennes and Lakota families at Little Bighorn. Most of the women took their children and retreated to safety. Some rode onto the battlefield singing strong heart songs of encouragement. But most of them really sadly watched for the fallen or injured men. One of those women was Antelope, or Kate Bighead, who later recalled seeing the lone woman warrior. Calf Trail woman had a 6-shooter with bullets and powder, and she fired many shots at the soldiers. She was the only woman there who had a gun. She stayed on her pony all the time, but she kept not far from her husband, Black Coyote. At one time, she was about to give her pony to a young Cheyenne who had lost his own. But I called out to them, "Our women have plenty of good horses for you down the river." She took the young Cheyenne up behind her on her own pony, and they rode away toward the river. The same woman was also the warrior when they went to the Reno Creek camp fight, and the soldiers were there as well. She was the only woman I know of who went with the warriors to fight. So now, Layla, you've shot your BB gun and your bow.
Yes, I have.
We know that you don't want to be in the armed forces or anything like that because
That's
you're afraid
right.
you're going to die.
Yeah.
But do you think it's still important for young girls to, shoot BB guns or bows or kind of do more outdoorsy things? Or do you think that's something that only boys should do?
Girls can do too, because I love doing it, and it would never be funner without not me doing it.
It wouldn't be as fun without you doing it?
Because I don't think it would be fair, because I really like doing that, so...
And this is a really tough topic to talk to you about because they talk about starvation and they talk about war. In the story, when she saves her brother, what do you think about that? Can you imagine Everett going to war, and would you just stand there and watch if he was hurt, or would you go and try to help him?
I would probably go and help him.
Right. And then you'd grab your BB gun and everyone would be safe, right?
I'll grab a BB gun and get everybody, especially that guy that had it.
Wow, that was a pretty intense voice. It isn't known how she acquired her skills with a gun. Layla learned from her Opa, but Buffalo Calf Road first rose to prominence among her people at the battle. As the battle raged, she fought bravely. Those warriors observing the scene were greatly impressed, since they themselves had hesitated, thinking the situation was too impossible to save Comes in sights. Victorious, her people actually named the battle for her. They refer to the battle as the battle where the girl saved her brother and called her Brave Woman. General George Armstrong Custer still led his troops against an encampment of the Cheyenne, Lakota, and other tribes camped along Little Bighorn River. Buffalo Calf Road again joined the warriors and fought bravely for her people. And again, she was the only woman to do so. During the battle, she rescued a young warrior who lost his horse. Again, victorious, the tribes regrouped, each going their own way. She is mentioned in the Thomas B. Marquette's story. Well, he published a book in 1967, Custer on Little Bighorn, and he includes the account of a female eyewitness who says, and quote, "Most of the women looking at the battle stayed out of reach of the bullets, as I did. But there was one woman who went in close at times. Her name was Calf Road Woman. She had a 6-shooter with bullets and powder. She fired many shots at the soldiers. She was the only woman there who had a gun. End quote. Following the tribe's victory at Little Bighorn, the United States redoubled its efforts to hunt down off-reservation Indians. Over 1,200 Cheyenne took to the hills and were pursued by U.S. troops. For many months, several Cheyenne band together, eluded capture, fled camps, and soldiers continued to attack. 5 months later, the Cheyenne village was viciously attacked again by soldiers in the early morning hours. When it was over, more than 40 Cheyenne lay dead, many wounded, and the village burned to the ground. Forced to flee again, this time without blankets, adequate clothing or food, Buffalo Calf Road and her people made their way through a freezing, blinding snowstorm that descended on them. The first night in the icy cold, 11 babies had frozen to death. The Indians were relentlessly pursued. Slowly, most of the Cheyenne surrendered, but despite being pregnant, Buffalo Calf Road refused to surrender, holding out with a small group of about 30 Cheyenne hostiles, quote unquote, including some children. During this difficult period of extreme hardship, she had a second child. Eventually, with deteriorating conditions, the Army's promise of land of their own, the small band surrendered, only to learn they would soon be sent to what is now known as Oklahoma. Troops forced march them 1,500 miles to Indian Territory and imprisoned them at Fort Reno. Nearly 50 Cheyennes died en route, and many more succumbed to malaria and exhaustion in the extreme Oklahoma heat. In September 1878, some 300 Cheyennes, led by Dull Knife and Little Wolf, escaped and headed north toward home. After a long forced march, they arrived in Indian Territory in inhabitable land, in an unfamiliar climate with unknown disease and a really circumscribed life. Conditions were so bad that they decided to go off on their own. So when the chiefs, Dull Knife and Little Wolf, escaped, Buffalo Calf Road went with them, and she was fairly determined to return home. She escaped during the night on foot and began the harsh journey north. And you have to be mindful, she's still a young woman with her husband and 2 young children. They managed to keep going despite numerous battles with soldiers and really just dodging them and trying their best to stay alive. She fought bravely in defense of her people. She was exhausted, she was hungry, and continued on foot for about 1,500 miles. She finally arrived north, and when they got there, the group had split. There was some kind of disagreement about really how to proceed and where to go. One group under Dull Knife headed to Red Cloud's Lakota village, believing they would find shelter there and be protected. But the Army captured and imprisoned them at Fort Robinson, demanding that they return south. In despair, deprived of food and water, they broke out of prison and on a bitterly cold day tried to escape, only to be massacred. Over 65 Cheyenne men, women, and children were killed. The other group under Chief Little Wolf included Buffalo Calf Road. They were able to hide for a period in the sand hills of Nebraska. Buffalo Calf Road's woman, her husband, had slowly been descending into a kind of madness and killed one of the tribe's leaders, Black Crane, during an argument. It just continued to create more tensions and more animosity within the tribe, and he was essentially banished. Calf, her children, and a handful of relatives left with him. A short time later, the Army captured Little Wolf's group. Eventually, Buffalo Calf Road's party was also captured and imprisoned. When the last capture happened of her, it's noted that she died of diphtheria. She did not live to see her beloved Cheyenne settled on land of their own in 1884 in southeastern Montana, a place known as Lame Deer Reservation. Cheyenne warriors recorded Buffalo Calf Road's woman's courageous ride into Rosebud Battle into 2 drawings, and we had referenced them earlier. They also named the battle where the girl saved her brother. Each January since 1999, Cheyenne runners participate in a 400-mile memorial run from Fort Robinson, Nebraska, to the Northern Cheyenne Reservation in honor of their ancestors who fought for their freedom and sovereignty, and they include Buffalo Calf Road woman in this memorial. Now, Layla, as part of the journey that they do every year to support this, it's a 400-mile run. Do you remember when we drove to South Dakota in the Black Hills, and that's from Minnesota going to the Black Hills of South Dakota? Could you imagine walking that in the middle of winter, and not only walking it, but walking it with you and your brothers at a young age? Now, be mindful, it's the middle of winter, so think of it as January months. Could you imagine that?
I am imagining that crazy.
Now, imagine that you did it without blankets or proper footwear or food.
I would die.
You would probably die. Do you think that in this story of Buffalo Calf Road woman, do you think that if someone came to us in our house in Minnesota in Champlin and said, "We want your land, you need to leave in a week," would you think that would be fair, especially in the middle of winter?
I would think no, 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 no.
Now, do you think if someone came to Champlin and said, "We can't be in our house anymore," how would you feel about that? Would you want to stay, or would you go and say, "Okay, we'll take half the money, half the land, and we will go to Montana"? Would you be okay with that?
I would get super duper duper mad. I would stay there and I'd be like, "My house, my rules, not your house."
Would you want to participate in the memorial run that they have for the Cheyenne Reservation, and doing the 400-mile memorial run?
What?
Would you want to do that with me?
No.
It's still too long, even as a memorial run. Even though you know you're going to have the right food and the right dress and the right supplies, it's still not something you're interested in.
I'm not running because today at PA I had to do just one lap around like 1/4 of a mile, and I got tired out really bad.
Just 1/4 of a mile you got tired out. And this is from a 9-year-old Layla Mothko.
No. 1/2. Sorry.
Oh, it was only 1/2 of a mile.
Yeah, 1/2.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for our latest episode of Liberating the Queen. As always, we appreciate you listening. There will be a blog companion that will give you all the references and all the quotes in here. I do want to encourage everyone to go to their history museum. There'll be plenty of books that I'll link to purchase and really learn as much as you can about the Native American culture. In the Midwest, there's a lot of it out there that we should really be teaching in schools, but we're currently not. So I will be educating my daughter as we go along. But there also is a lot happening, especially in current events with Standing Rock and other things that are going out in the world. So I would encourage everyone just to continue reading and continue learning. We will continue to find ways to honor women like Buffalo Calf Road Woman with our podcasts. And as always, liberating the Queen. So, Layla, what's one piece that you, and be mindful, everyone, she's 9 years old. Layla, what's the one piece that you learned from this story that you'll take with you?
Probably the part where she
went into battle?
Yeah, that part.
That was pretty scary.
I was surprised because most girls back a long time ago weren't in there.
Right.
But right now, there's a lot of girls.
There's a lot more girls in there.
Yeah.
And I think, like, if you put it in the context of your brother, like Everett, you would go in there and do it. And I think there's a lot more people in that context of if there's someone that they know would help them, regardless if they're a boy or a girl, right?
Yeah.
Well, thank you, everyone. Do you want to say thank you, Layla?
Thank you.
We'll see you next month when we look at another brave woman on liberating the queen.